Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to this term's seminars at the History of Garden and Landscape seminars at the Institute of Historical Research. We're very glad to see those of you who've returned, and any of you new, we welcome you. This term's theme is conversations across continents, the movement of garden ideas, styles, and plants across the globe. Among the topics that will be examined are botanical knowledge that arrived in Europe from 17th century Brazil, the impact of Moorish gardens in Spain on 16th century Italian gardens, and European attitudes to Japanese gardens in the 19th century, and Japanese attitudes toward European ideas of Japanese gardens at the same time. I'll talk now just briefly. I'll go through our sort of litany of practical matters, and then I will introduce Dr. Kroupa. Just to remind you that when the paper starts, if you'd please mute yourselves and also turn off your video, that would be very useful. At any time, you can write questions on the chat board, and at the end, please put your questions on the chat board, and then I'll relay them to Dr. Kroupa. I think that's all I need to say in a practical way, so I'll introduce Sebestian now. Dr. Sebestian Kroupa is going to introduce the work of Dr. Georg Kamel, the first Westerner to study plants in the Philippines and to send information about them to botanists and horticulturists in Europe. Dr. Kroupa is a historian of early modern science and medicine, specializing in cross-cultural exchanges of knowledge and objects on a global scale. He received his PhD in 2019 from Cambridge, with a dissertation on communications of natural knowledge between the Philippines and Europe. He subsequently joined the Renaissance Skin Project of King's College London, where he focused on early modern Filipino tattooing. And he's recently returned to Cambridge to take up a Liverhume early career fellowship with a project on modern trans-Pacific exchanges of plants and the knowledge and practices associated with them. Sebestian, we're very, very pleased to welcome you today, and we look forward to hearing you on this subject.
Thank you, Michael, for the introduction, and many thanks to the organizers for their invitation and the opportunity to present my work. It's a great pleasure to be here. So as you can probably tell from the title, my paper today draws on one of the chapters from my PhD dissertation, which I'm currently turning into a monograph, and which is concerned with the communication of medical and natural knowledge between the Philippines and Europe in the late 17th century. My PhD has traced movements of knowledge from the point of local encounters between indigenous peoples and European colonists to sort of worldwide movements and receptions, as I seek to decenter previous accounts of the mobility of early modern knowledge and emphasize the plurality of sites, agents, and traditions involved in the making of science and medicine. In my talk today specifically, I will focus on the practices of the Jesuit pharmacist Georg Joseph Kamel. In 1687, Camel was sent as a missionary to the Philippines, which was then a colony under the Spanish flag. And during his stay, he produced treatises concerned with Philippine plants, in which he included episodes from his medical practice. And I will use these sources to demonstrate how Camel understood Philippine nature and how he appropriated local medicinal plants into European frameworks of knowledge. Our previous work concerned with European encounters with new worlds has tended to highlight the search of the colonists for new profitable plants on the one hand, and the insufficiency of European remedies in the face of new realities on the other hand. Kamel's work offers a very different view. Although he regularly did adopt native plants into his medical practice, I argue that he understood these plants predominantly as substitutes for European medicines, which were too expensive to import. He interpreted Philippine plants through the lens of Galenic humoral theory and canonical authors of the Old World. And in this way, he sought to Galenize Philippine plants, that is, to appropriate them into the humoral framework and thus facilitate their circulation on both local and global scales and markets. So tonight I will first explain how and why Kamel used Galenic theory to interpret Philippine plants. Subsequently, I will discuss the case of the St Ignatius bean, a drug native to the Philippines, to illustrate how Kamel appropriated local plants. By tracing the bean's trajectory from local contexts to its introduction in European markets, I will show how a medicinal plant used by indigenous communities became a globally consumed commodity. Now, although Kamel's methods facilitated the introduction of the St. Ignatius bean in Europe, some elements of his work were lost in translation. And to provide an example of such a disruption, I will end by discussing Kamel's system of plant classification and his use of indigenous knowledge. So Kamel was born in 1661 in Brno in the present-day Czech Republic, where he was educated at the local Jesuit college. He entered the Society of Jesus in 1682 as a lay brother before beginning his apprenticeship in pharmacy. He was trained in the Galenic tradition, and his understanding of medicine was humoral. In 1687, Kamel was listed among the Czech Jesuits selected for the Philippine mission. Upon his arrival in Manila, sometime between 1688 and 9, Kamel added to the establishments of the local Jesuit college the first pharmacy in the Philippines. His workshop was located in the southernmost part of the Intramuros, or the Spanish walled city. Kamel's fellow missionary, Pedro Murillo Velarde, described how the pharmacy held, quote, plenty of remedies for the common good, stored in flasks, jars, and fine earthenware from China and Japan, with various decorations and paintings, end quote. In colonial Manila, medical professional hierarchies and identities were less rigid than in Europe. And in addition to working as a pharmacist, Kamel also saved the college the salary paid to the physician, as he himself filled this position. To his pharmacy, Kamel soon added, quote, a garden consisting entirely of rare and medicinal herbs, end quote. Now, for religious missionaries, the creation and maintenance of gardens was as much a physical process as a symbolic one. Inspired by the metaphor of the Garden of Eden, gardens were places where wilderness was tamed and nature transformed through labor into orderly space controlled by humans. This was not only a utilitarian project to provide missionaries with useful plants, but also a representation of godly order and divine peace. And it was no accident that Kamel's medicinal plot in the middle of the cloisters was surrounded with rose bushes, flowers symbolic of martyrdom, purity, and the splendor of paradise to the Catholics. Now, Kamel's medical duties led him to explore local nature, the specimens of which he began to collect and document in order to identify resources which he could use in his medical practice. As his notes reveal, Kamel used his garden to transplant and grow plants that could prove useful, as well as to conduct further observations and trials. He described how he received seeds of medicinal plants from all across the region, which he grew into adult specimens. He also described encountering a young specimen of a strange herb in the wilderness, which upon transplantation developed into a species of wolfsbane. And he also described growing a species of mimosa in his garden, where, quote, I and my friends often recreate its movements, end quote. So just as for practitioners in Europe, Kamel's workshop and garden were sites of research and socialization, in which they carried out observations and experiments, as well as meeting customers and both current and prospective informants. Promptly after his arrival in the Philippines, Kamel established himself as a colonial medical authority. The limited number of competitors in Manila acted in his favor. As he confessed to his compatriots, Szymon Boruchratsky, who was stationed in Mexico, there is no physician here but 4 friars, who know little more than my pair of trousers. Under Kamel's tenure, the Jesuit pharmacy became one of the most reputable colonial medical establishments in Manila, and his reputation soon spread beyond the Philippine Islands. By the late 1690s, Kamel was engaged in a correspondence network which extended from New Spain across the Philippines to London. And his involvement in this network enabled Kamel to deliver his reports of Philippine nature to London, where they appeared in print. Now, most of Kamel's descriptions of Philippine plants were published as an appendix to the 3rd volume of John May's Historia Plantarum, or the History of Plants, and the remainder of Kamel's treatises came out in the Philosophical Transactions. A few drawings were also printed in James Pettiver's periodicals, such as my favorite illustration, the flying cat monkey, which you can see on the right here. Kamel's accounts shed light on the patients he treated and the drugs that he employed. He commanded a broad clientele, which predominantly included his fellow Jesuit brothers, but included also crown officials, the poor, indigenes, and slaves alike. In his treatments, Kamel extensively relied on plants native to the Philippines. One of the local herbs he claimed to have used regularly was tanglat, a rush-like plant. Kamel wrote that tanglat stimulates the evacuation of urine, menses, fetuses, gas, watery edema, and renal calculi, as well as acting as a laxative, as I had tried with 4 patients who were suffering from considerable constipation. Although Kamel regularly drew on native substances, a closer look at his accounts reveals that he saw local plants predominantly through the prism of European drugs and Galenic theory. He adopted tanglat into his practice because he had previously identified it as a kind of squinen, which was a plant recommended by classical Greco-Roman authorities against obstructions of humus. So this suggests that Kamel combed local nature for plants related to those he already knew and which he could use as substitutes in the treatments he had learned at home. In this respect, Kamel was drawing on a long pharmaceutical tradition of succedania, or replacements. This established practice was modeled on the treatise De Succedaneis attributed to Galen, which provided practical lists of substances that could replace ingredients that were rare, expensive, or simply unavailable at the time of need. Early modern handbooks advised that substitutes should agree in their virtues, nature, and characteristics, such as taste and smell. And indeed, Kamel's associations were typically based on morphology, like in the case of tanglat, often used in combination with sensory cues as well. For example, he believed the herb suganda, quote, smelled of thyme and oregano, end quote, and therefore used the herb as a substitute for the two plants. Therefore, Kamel's investigation of local nature seemed not to be motivated by the hunger to discover new profitable plants, so much as by the desire to find substitutes for those already known to him. Kamel searched for locally available substitutes largely due to the high costs associated with importing drugs. As I discuss in my PhD, the Royal Hospital in Manila, in which Kamel did not work and which was funded and administered by the Spanish Crown. So this Royal Hospital in Manila received enormous consignments of European drugs every year. In 1642 and 1717, which are the 2 years for which complete inventories survive, the hospital received shipments of 1,200 and 1,500 kilograms of remedies, respectively. In 1717, the price of the drugs imported that year exceeded 10,000 pesos. To put this rather complex and expensive enterprise into perspective, the salary of the hospital's physician was in the region of a few hundred pesos per year. Compared to the Spanish crown, the funds available to the Philippine Jesuits were considerably more modest. To finance their medical establishments, religious orders relied on combinations of donations from the local populations and authorities, on their own monastic coffers, and also on sponsorship from the crown. The amount annually dispensed by the crown to the Philippine Jesuits was a meager 150 pesos, so about 1.5% of the sum that the crown spent on the drugs for the Royal Hospital. As the Jesuits constantly complained, this royal subsidy was hardly sufficient to secure adequate medical provisions, and the lengthy transportation created additional issues regarding preservation. In 1686, the Jesuit treasurer of the Philippine province, Luis de Morales, lamented that the imported medicines are of such bad quality that they are more likely to harm than help the patients, and hence the pharmacists fear administering them not to put in risk the health of those who at such a cost to your majesty have been brought to these missions. It was predominantly for this reason that Kamel turned to what local nature could offer. Since the importation of remedies was a pricey, lengthy, and uncertain business, local substances were used out of necessity and primarily as substitutes for the rare, expensive, or unavailable European drugs. Galenism not only underpins this adherence to old world remedies, but it also offered a compelling framework for the understanding and adoption of plants from these new worlds. Due to its flexibility, Galenism could be used to describe new realities and facilitate their translation into frameworks understandable to the Europeans. The efforts to Galenize local plants were intricately intertwined with the processes of appropriation and commodification. Indeed, local substances presented opportunities for financial profit. The engagements of the Jesuits in the drug trade have received particular attention, especially with respect to their involvement in the extraction and distribution of cinchona, which even earned the drug the moniker the Jesuits bar. The Philippines offer another example, the St Ignatius bean. Kamel's treatise on the bean, which was published in 1699 in the Philosophical Transactions, was the first comprehensive account of the plant printed in Europe. Locally called igasud, the plant has been identified by modern botanists with Strychnos ignatii, a tree native to the Visayan Islands, where its seeds had been used in healing prior to the European arrival. The eastern portion of the Visayas fell under the Jesuits' jurisdiction, and it was probably here that they learned about the seeds' powers. By rebranding igasud as the beans of St Ignatius, the founder of the Jesuit order, the Jesuits sought to impose their authority and their trademark upon the remedy. However, adopting knowledge acquired from indigenous sources raised two major issues. Firstly, and crucially for Catholic missionaries, there were spiritual concerns at play. Since the Filipinos had been pagans prior to the Spanish arrival, their knowledge of igasud could have come from the devil, and its powers could well be demonic. So to place the source of knowledge of the being on what they considered legitimate, non-indigenous foundations, the Jesuits had to dissociate it from the local context. Basically, effacement of indigenous agency presented the safest way towards adoption. And indeed, missionaries in Jesuit works commonly appeared to be simply using indigenous plants without having received any local help, discovering their virtues by accident or divine inspiration, and testing them through experience. With igasud specifically, the Jesuits framed its discovery as a fortuitous accident. In his treatise, Kamel recounted a captivating story of a Jesuit priest saved by the beans when a spiteful indigene attempted to poison him. And it was casuality, or literally by chance, that the priest happened to have a giant bean on him, which was the first occasion that the Spaniards learned about the virtues and powers of igasud. And this chance discovery led to further investigations, the results of which Kamel subsequently recounted. Secondly, to reinvent the bean as a legitimate drug and enable its movement from its point of origin, the bean had to be embedded within theoretical frameworks acknowledged as valid by the Europeans. And it was through Galenization that the Jesuits sought to embed the drug within a system familiar to European experts and customers. Now, based on its morphology, taste, and other qualities, Kamel recognized igasud as the nux vomica of the Arabian physician Serapion the Younger, whose work had been assimilated into the Galenic corpus centuries prior. Now, associations between local plants and canonical authors appear throughout Kamel's writings and the works of other Jesuit missionaries around the world. Efforts to match plants described by the ancients with their contemporary counterparts were a widespread practice with long humanist roots, as the true identity of the plants had been lost over the centuries, but their efficacy is certified by the highest authorities. And Kamel could identify Philippine plants with those described by ancient authors without any intrinsic contradictions, because the regions of East Indies and its products, such as cinnamon and nutmeg, were known to ancient writers. So in the eyes of European scholarship, it was by no means impossible that a plant mentioned by classical authors should be native to lands far to the east, even as far as the Philippines. Establishing commonality between the old and the new was the first step towards assimilation. So it was by identifying local plants with those described by ancient authors that the Jesuits downplayed their novelty and introduced them to European readers in a familiar guise. Moreover, especially importantly for the Jesuits, by embedding plants of foreign worlds into schemes that were both ancient and familiar to Europe, the Jesuits could construct unified histories of the world that could be traced back to Noah and the Garden of Eden. The parallels between nature and people of Europe and of other worlds enabled the Jesuits to highlight the shared humanity of those people and the non-Europeans' potential for conversion. So to Galenize igasud and appropriate it into European frameworks, Kamel had to demonstrate that it shared key properties with Nux vomica. Serapion himself praised Nux vomica for its emetic qualities. Quote, "It helps to vomit and sets humors in motion, making it easier for them to come out by vomiting." End quote. In addition to pointing to similarities in morphology, Kamel presented several cases from his medical practice, which clearly attested to the bean's emetic virtues. Based on the evidence gathered, Kamel concluded that the bean, quote, "frequently tends to induce vomiting," end quote. He thus bolstered the Galenic associations he had drawn and presented the knowledge of the bean's virtues as emerging from Jesuit trials rather than as borrowed from local healing practices. Now, Kamel's experiments also revealed some rather undesirable side effects. He reported that most of his patients suffered from violent seizures. To give an example, I once diluted 1 scruple of the powder of igasud and gave it to Vicente Alsina, who was a fellow Jesuit missionary endowed with a melancholic constitution, to provoke regurgitation, as you would with the St Ignatius bean. He was troubled with indigestion, diarrhea, frequent nausea, sour belching, and copious flatulence. As soon as he took it, he was seized with a tremor of the whole body, which lasted for 3 hours, together with an itching and terrible convulsive twitching, so that he could not stand. It was strongest and most troublesome in his jaws, forcing him to a kind of laugh. He was having a seizure. Meanwhile, there was no notable alteration in the pulse, and there were no other subsequent symptoms. Afterwards, he felt somewhat better. Well, good for him, really. Kamel ascribed these violent effects to the differences between indigenous and European bodies. Quote, "In Spaniards, igasud almost always causes spasmodic convulsions, but not in the indigenes." End quote. This observation was again in line with Galenic theory, which posited that European and indigenous human constitutions, reared under very different climates, would differ and therefore react to the same substance in different ways. Kamel recommended to his European leaders to use the bean with caution and in small doses. His experiments with native materia medica therefore seems to be motivated partly by the desire to test its suitability for European humoral constitutions or for European medical clients, both in Manila and beyond. And in these assessments, the Jesuits used as instruments the bodies of the colonists, of the indigenes, and quite likely, as we can see, of their own. So Kamel's treatment of the St. Ignatius bean suggests that to be redefined as a drug, the bean has to be stripped of its original cultural context and codified within European theoretical frameworks. Foreign substances were inherently regarded with skepticism, which was overcome through the testing and recontextualization of plants into European frameworks. Through inscription into the Galenic corpus, local plants were turned into legitimate drugs and indigenous beliefs into legitimate knowledge. The reinvention of igasud as a Galenic medicine paved the way for its deployment on both local and global scales and markets. Indeed, when browsing through 18th century European works of materia medica, there is only one drug native to the Philippines that appears regularly, the St. Ignatius bean. Its supply was mediated by the Jesuits, who were involved in the early modern commerce of other drugs as well, most prominently the aforementioned Jesuits bark or cinchona. The bean seems to have been imported to Europe in relatively low quantities, partly due to the distance and lacking infrastructure, partly as the Jesuits sought to safeguard its nature as rare and exclusive goods. For instance, During the entire 18th century, the bean featured in only 17 transactions at Amsterdam public auctions, which suggests that although it was known to traders and apothecaries, it was not very widely available. Indeed, the Jesuits did not need to import the drug in vast amounts to make it commerce profitable. The bean could be displayed as a curiosity, donated as a gift to patrons, or used as a bribe to solicit favors from officials. The bean's value was rooted in its rarity and the status as a curiosity that it carried, or the faraway Philippine archipelago that it represented. Indeed, the bean commanded high price and esteem in 18th century Europe. For example, in 1730, while waiting in Seville for his ship to New Spain, the German Jesuit missionary Philip Zegesser sent home to his brother, quote, 25 St Ignatius beans, which are greatly desired both in Rome and in Vienna, and one has to consider it a blessing to get one or two, end quote. Still in 1749, the bean appeared among the most expensive items available in the drug trading hub of Lisbon. So over the course of the 18th century, the bean was increasingly finding its way into pharmacies and pharmacopoeias across Europe. Despite this proliferation of new inquiries, Camel's treatise in the Philosophical Transactions remained an authoritative account throughout the 18th century. Even 50 years after its initial appearance, the German scholar Caspar Neumann wrote, quote, that the best account we have to date of this plant and of the origin of this so-called St. Ignatius bean is from Father Camel, end quote. This longevity can be attributed to the privileged access to the source material that Camel possessed, which enabled him to provide a detailed description and figures based on observation of the entire plant rather than just of its commodified seeds. European scholars were keenly interested in the plant's morphological features, with information which was central to 18th century classification practices. Although, unlike Camel, scholars in Europe generally considered the bean to be a new drug, unknown to the ancients, Camel's association with Serapions nux vomica endured and earned the bean a clearly defined place in European traditions of materia medica, as the two plants were very commonly treated and classified together. Most authors warned of the bean's powerful effects and advised cautious use, drawing among other on the examples provided by Camel himself. As the bean was becoming integrated into the European pharmacopoeia, any mentions of indigenous knowledge and uses discussed in Camel's account were increasingly marginalized, whereas Jesuit missionaries had to be aware of the bean's local Filipino meanings and significance. This information had little value for European scholars. So in a rather symptomatic way for European science and medicine, this lack of concern for non-European knowledge is probably the main reason why so many modern sources, including Wikipedia, for example, wrongly credit Camel with discovering and naming the St. Ignatius bean. Publishing a treatise in a European journal translated here into ownership and control over the drug. So in my final part of the talk, I will show that despite the success story of the St. Ignatius bean, not all elements of Camel's work were successfully transmitted from the Philippines into European context, and some were indeed lost in translation. One such example was Camel's system of plant classification. Now, early modern attempts to systematize the plant kingdom commonly started with the division between herbs and trees. Although the philosophical limitations of this bipartite method were widely discussed, it was retained by most authors, including Camel's correspondent in London, John May. In Kamel's classification of Philippine flora, he was clearly inspired by Ray's method, whose masterpiece, Historia Plantarum, he saw at a friend's several years ago and considered a work supremely brilliant, for which all posterity will give you deserved credit. Kamel used similar criteria of arrangement and directly borrowed many of Ray's classes, which would have facilitated the reception of Kamel's work in Europe. But there was one exception, which distinguished Kamel from Ray and other European botanists. In addition to herbs and trees, Kamel added one further main division: climbing plants or vines. To my knowledge, the decision to use climbing plants as one of the main categories and thus create a tripartite scheme has no parallel in early modern European natural history. Kamel never explained his decision to abandon the traditional dichotomy between herbs and trees, and therefore we can only speculate about his reasons. It is unlikely that Kamel's inspiration came from Europe. So instead, I suggest that we should look for answers in the local context. In the Philippines, Kamel was confronted with an abundance of plants, such as lianas, that did not fit comfortably into either of the two European categories, a challenge that sedentary European scholars did not typically face. It was most probably to accommodate for this misfit that Kamel dissolved to devise a whole new category. Incidentally, Filipino indigenous taxonomies commonly include vines or climbing plants as one of the divisions, typically alongside herbs and woody plants. For example, the Tagalog people, with whom Kamel interacted most extensively, traditionally distinguish four main groups of plants, identical to those used by Kamel: trees, shrubs, herbs, and vines. Note that Kamel grouped trees and shrubs into a single category to create a tripartite system. The Ifugao people in northern Luzon even use an identical tripartite system to the one used by Kamel. So this evidence raises the possibility that Kamel's classification system was actually inspired by indigenous categories of knowledge. Kamel himself did not directly acknowledge any such influences. His approach to indigenous knowledge was rather ambivalent. In his private correspondence, we can find hints at his high regard for local expertise. In 1690, he wrote that a specific condition was very dangerous in these islands due to the lack of wise women able to cure it. Later, he reaffirmed his respect for the indigenes and their abilities in one of his letters, in which he praised the ingenious and knowledgeable inhabitants of Luzon, Luzon being the largest Philippine islands in which Manila is located and where Kamel was stationed as well. Now, this contrasts rather sharply with his aforementioned opinion on his Spanish medical competition, which he compared to his pair of trousers. And indeed, there are indications that Kamel worked closely with indigenous informants. For example, he occasionally left gaps in his notes for vernacular names, probably to be obtained later from a local source. Despite these hints, indigenous people left very few traces in Kamel's publications, which were intended for European readers. He probably realized that his learned European audiences might be at odds with knowledge derived from local sources. Although Kamel's accounts are brimming with detailed information about local habits and customs, no indigenous informant is ever acknowledged by name. In only very few cases did Kamel recognize drawing directly on indigenous knowledge. In one of his treatises, for example, he included a compilation of notes that he had, quote, acquired not from my own experience, but vicariously, collected and excerpted from various observations and remarks from both the indigenes and otherwise curious persons, end quote. For Kamel, useful knowledge could be located anywhere in the world, including among the Filipinos. But the source of such information was questionable for reasons that I have already discussed, and needed to be verified and ascribed to experience and observation in order to avoid any associations with demonic powers. For example, in his treatise of Tugus, a fragrant bush related to cardamom, Kamel wrote, on account of the agreeable smell that the berries of Tugus emit, the Filipinos wear them around their necks. Besides, experience has taught them that these berries cure centipede bites when chewed and placed on the wound. But my favorite example is from Kamel's discussion of amuyong, which he also identified as a species of cardamom. He wrote, taught by magistra experiencia, or the master or teacher experience, the Filipinos and I know to use this in paralysis. So here, reliance on experience placed Kamel and the Filipinos at the same level in hierarchies of knowledge. Experience emerges here as a universal criteria that Kamel used to evaluate and legitimate different pieces of evidence, including those from indigenous sources. This suggests also that if portrayed as acquired empirically, non-European knowledge could be more easily assimilated into European systems. However, this is not what happens with Kamel's classification system and his climbing plans. When trying to publish his work in Europe, Kamel paid dearly for departing from the time-honored dichotomy between herbs and trees. They decided to leave out Kamel's section on climbing plants from his Historia altogether and included only Kamel's descriptions of trees and herbs. The third additional group, which Kamel introduced based on his local experience, simply could not be reconciled with Ray's own system and with the contemporary European botanical practice. Now, despite the unfortunate fate of his climbing plants, Kamel managed to publish most of his work in a major botanical publication of his time, even as a lowly Jesuit pharmacist stationed in a faraway Manila. His bold attempt to develop an original plant classification scheme points to his ambitions to establish himself as a learned botanist. Kamel's system was as much a product of global ambitions as it was of global borrowings. Because here we can observe how the work of a Bohemian Jesuit missionary stationed in the Philippines was shaped by that of a sedentary English naturalist. So this example highlights the proliferation of early modern global links and their power to shape scientific practices in geographically distinct contexts. Kamel's category of climbing plants then shows how these global influences readily interacted and became entangled with local contingencies. But even if well suited for systematizing Philippine nature, this foreign hybrid group found little appreciation among sedentary European naturalists and became lost in translation between Manila and London. So to quickly conclude my paper, Kamel's practices demonstrate that European medical traditions proved flexible enough to accommodate for plants native to the Philippines, which enabled Kamel to downplay their novelty and embed them within received European knowledge. Kamel looked at Philippine plants through the prism of the Galenic humoral theory, as he searched for local substitutes for remedies already known to him. Kamel's projects therefore offer an interesting nuance to prevailing narratives of colonial bioprospecting and the European hunger for the so-called green gold. Not all European encounters with new substances were bioprospective, and colonial sites did not by default yield new drugs for European exploitation. For Kamel, classical works represented essential instrument for understanding and appropriating Philippine nature. It was by recourse to the language of antiquity that Kamel was able to describe novelty. In his work, canonical authors and their plans, such as Serapion and his Nux Vomica, feature essentially as dictionary categories. Stripped of their contextual meaning and stabilized through centuries of tradition, they were fixed enough to mediate across different contexts. Prior to the establishment of the Linnaean system, ancient terminology provided a stable enough language in an increasingly fragmented Europe and offered a degree of continuity amid the early modern flood of names and objects. It was through naming and assimilation into familiar schemes that European naturalists turned foreign plants into understandable entities. Through incorporation into the Galenic corpus, Kamel sought to turn local remedies into drugs and indigenous beliefs into legitimate knowledge. Importantly, as shown by the example of the St Ignatius bean, Galenization not only facilitated its local adoption, but also equipped it for movement beyond the Philippines and introduction in European markets worldwide. However, it is important to emphasize that even if the St. Ignatius bean was a success story for the Jesuits, reliance on identical strategies did not necessarily guarantee the successful transplantation of all Philippine flora. The St. Ignatius bean was in fact the only drug native to the Philippines to enter the European pharmacopoeia in the 18th century. And in accordance with Galenic theory, the question of the bean's suitability for European bodies still remained an obstacle to its wider circulation. As illustrated by the bean's violent effects on unaccustomed European bodies, and also by the fate of Kamel's classification system, foreign substances and knowledge categories were always in danger of being regarded with skepticism by the Europeans. These stories of disruptions and limitations remind us how difficult it was to move knowledge around in the early modern world. Indeed, mobility was by no means a default property of knowledge. As we have also seen, the movements of information between the Philippines and Europe were accompanied by the increasing erosion of indigenous knowledge. Despite these efforts to efface local agencies, it is by recovering these processes of translation that we as historians stand to gain insights into what cross-cultural knowledge encounters entailed. Thank you very much for listening.